my good friend for more than a decade or so. We constantly interacting with each other. And before starting the event, we will begin our entire event by the invocation by Aniruddha.
शारदा शारदां भोजवदना वदनाम्बुजे सर्वदा सर्वदास्माकं सन्निधिं सन्निधिं क्रियात् चिदानन्दकलावाणी वन्दे चन्द्रकलाधरां नैर्माल्यतारतम्येन बिम्बितां चित्तवृत्तिषु महाकविं काम्भोजमणिपञ्जरशायिकां चैतन्यजलधिज्योत्स्नां देवीं वन्दे सरस्वती.
Thank you, Aniruddha. It is a great pleasure to have Kundan Singh today. And when Kundan Singh decided to come to India after his recent book on colonialism, which is part of his larger enterprise of how to think about Indian culture, Indian tradition, etc. Largely so far we knew Kundan Singh because of his work on psychology. And even now his work is fundamentally in psychology. He is a psychologist by training. But this work that he created actually talks much more deeply about how do we rethink about India in the modern academic space, how do we start reflecting academically about Indian culture, and what are the some kind of crises that we have today. You know, it's a larger problem that he's dealing with. That's why we titled his talk as Decolonizing Social Sciences. And there are specific issues that he deals with, James Mill, colonialism and other subsequent problems, and some of us who are part of the social sciences deal with the similar kind of issues in our classrooms as well. At least Saurabh and myself, we have been dealing with some of these themes as part of our teaching process. So I thought it would be ideal to have him to give a general talk for the audience, because our university is generally interested in ideas and other related domains. And we are running a two-day workshop on Indian psychology, where he has certain specific proposals on how do we rethink about Indian psychology. And he has published quite a bit around that theme, both in terms of methods of how do we approach this problem and what would be the consequence if we take certain routes. So given that background, it is an extremely a great occasion, great pleasure to have him here. I request Vinay to introduce him.
Chaitra has already done the job. Namaste and a warm welcome to Kundan Singh ji and all our esteemed faculty friends at the university. It's indeed a pleasure to have Kundan ji here. He's currently the professor and core faculty at Sofia University in Palo Alto, where he has been teaching courses on transpersonal psychology and many other subjects related to psychology. For nearly, I think, more than 15 years now, from 2009 onwards. And then he's also the current president of Cultural Integration Fellowship, which is established in 1951 by Hari Chaudhary ji, who was the disciple of Swami Vivekananda. So one of his earliest disciples who went to the West and started a movement of Indian psychology. This was Hari Chaudhary ji, so who started this Cultural Integration Fellowship, and also the other institute called as Academy of Asian Religions, which later came to be known as California Institute for Integral Studies. In fact, it was one of the pioneering institutes earlier that time, which tried to bring in not so dominant views concerning human phenomena, psychology, and try to integrate it with the mainstream. That was one of the earliest, if I can say so, in that manner, which was, he's also a faculty there. He has been associated with the California Institute of Integral Studies for a long time. And he's also part of the Hindu University of America, which is again almost a decade-old university based out of Florida in US, but has gained new vigor in last 3 to 4 years and 5 years, and they have been doing exceptionally well, especially on the online front. He's been part of their team which guides the entire research at Hindu University of America. And more than all these things, he is known through his writings, which are quite sharp, critical, analytical, especially concerning the Indian psychology, or probably his most interested areas are postmodernism, deconstruction and reconstruction, which he uses these tools to see the lacuna in the dominant approaches of psychology and create a legitimate space for alternative views, and specifically the Indian thought. That has been his passion, his battle in the US itself for nearly two decades now, and we are very happy to have him here. Once again, a warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Chhatraji and Vinayji. Thank you for inviting me here. Yes, Chhatraji and Vinayji I have known for a very long time, and I think we have watched one another's growth in this area, and it is true that we share very similar kinds of passions. We have been doing things in our own unique ways, and at the same time similar ways, with the goal of talking about the Indian tradition, the Indian culture, Indian knowledge systems. As far as my understanding goes, we have a tradition which has good description of cosmology, of philosophy, with a very comprehensive epistemology and methodology. Our traditions, our darshana traditions, have comprehensive epistemology and methodology with respect to knowledge pursuit. It is a different matter that they do not have legitimacy in this world. We don't even recognize them. In fact, when we begin to talk about the legitimacy of these traditions, there are more people in our own culture who oppose those endeavors, those efforts, than people on the outside. This brings me to the topic of our discussion today, Decolonizing Social Sciences, Changement, Colonialism and Contemporary India. This discussion is coming out from this book which I have recently published, titled Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children. The primary thesis of that book is that there was a particular kind of discourse which was generated in Britain in the 19th century, which still impacts the curriculum that the students in the United States study on India and Hinduism. The discourse that they study is politically correct and sanitized, but it has very close correspondence with what was generated in the 19th century. This is the thing about genealogy. When a particular discourse gets generated, and particularly in the Western world and the colonial world, if it begins to have the backing of power, it does not go away easily. It takes many shapes and forms, and it becomes part of the institutionalized system which the colonial people created. Sometimes what happens is that the individual who generated the discourse, he, and I'm deliberately saying he over here, disappears from the scene, goes subterranean or underground. But as he goes underground or subterranean, still influences the things that are going on in the past, in the present. So, you would say this book is about discourse in the United States. It is talking about the suffering of Indian American children. Why are you bringing this into the conversation over here? A very legitimate question to ask, right? Given that I keep questioning legitimacy all the time. My mind is never free from looking at the legitimacy of concerns, whether it is mine or it is of the others. So, what I want to share with you is that the first 4 chapters of the book have relevance on India and Hindu studies everywhere in the world. And they have deep implications for how social sciences are conducted here in India. I'm going to talk about a couple of chapters from the book, and then we will open up the forum for questions and discussions. I'm going to tell you about the history of British India, which was written by a character called James Mill. This book was published in 1817. The book was written in 3 volumes, and in the first volume you have 7 chapters on the Hindu people under the section of the Hindus. I believe that it is cardinally important for us to go through those 7 chapters. The general drift of the book is to describe the Hindu people as uncivilized and savage. These are not my words. These are not my interpretations. These are the words that James Mill is using on the Hindu people. He is describing the Hindu people as uncivilized, savage, uncouth, barbaric, rude, and in all the synonyms that you can find for these words. He is very liberal in the description. This is the larger canopy in which the discussion actually happens. Within this canopy, there is another theme which runs through all the chapters, which is describing the Hindu people as hierarchical and oppressive. His central thesis is that the Hindu people have been hierarchical and oppressive since antiquity, since the beginning of the time. Their social organization was hierarchical and oppressive. This is described in chapter 2 of the 7 chapters. In chapter 3, he talks about the Hindu form of governance, which is described as hierarchical and oppressive. In the next chapter, he talks about the laws of the Hindu people, in which he describes them as hierarchical and oppressive. In the subsequent chapter, he talks about the taxation system which was used in pre-colonial times. There also the story is the same. Then he has certain understanding about the religion of the Hindu people, which is Hinduism, and then in the final chapter he talks about the manners and customs of the Hindu people, in which, he is quite liberal in describing the Hindu people as women oppressors, effeminate, lazy, cowardly. Think of all the vices and you will find in the description. Many Europeans have written on the Indian people, on the Hindu people. Why am I talking about James Mill? So before I come to talking about James Mill, I am going to tell you who James Mill was. It is important to understand who James Mill was. And then this question will begin to make more sense. James Mill was born in Scotland in 1773. His parents had shoemaking and shoe selling business. But his mother did not want him to take this profession. The reason was that in 1748 there was an uprising that had taken place in Scotland, in which, of course, one side lost. And the side that lost was the side to which Mill's maternal grandfather belonged. As a consequence, the aristocracy of Mill's, Mill's mother's ancestry was taken away, and the family fell into bad times. Mill's mother wanted to recover that lost glory, and her heritage, her ancestry was not lost on her. So she decided that she would make James Mill the instrument of that pursuit. Now it so happened that James Mill was a precocious child. He was very good in studies. And his brilliance was recognized by the local aristocrats. So the local aristocrats decided to fund his education. They took him under his wings. The lady aristocrat, they incidentally were stewards as well, wanted him to become a preacher. And that is why, instead of getting trained or taught at the University of Aberdeen, which was closer, he was educated at University of Edinburgh, where he earned his bachelor's and master's in divinity studies. This he completed in 1797. He looked for a permanent position to become a preacher for the next 5 years, but he was not able to do so. So he decided to switch gears in terms of his career. He decided to come to London in 1802, which was a city of opportunities back then. And you can totally understand why. The wealth from India had already started pouring into London. So he decided to become a journalist. He comes to London and starts writing for periodicals and journals. And for one of the periodicals, he was manning the India desk. What was happening in India at that point in time? The Asiatic Society in Kolkata had already been formed. Texts from India were getting translated, and they were flowing in hordes to Britain. And James Mill was writing reviews for the materials that were coming from India. Now around 1806 or so, he decided that he would write a comprehensive account on India. What were the reasons? The reasons were, number one, he thought that the information that Britain had on India, or the European world had on India, was very disparate and at variance with one another. So they all needed to be knit together in a coherent context. That was number one. Number two was that he thought that an account like the one that he had in his mind would help the East India Company to govern India in a much better way. So he had in mind that his treatise would eventually become a governance manual. So earlier he thought that he would work on this project for 3-4 years and get going with his life. but destiny had something else in mind. In 1808, he came across a gentleman by the name of Jeremy Bentham. So people who have political science background and people who have background in legal studies would be familiar with this name. This is a big name, because Jeremy Bentham is considered the father of utilitarianism. And why this is important? Utilitarianism ended up transforming first Britain and then later the entire Western world in a big way. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Jeremy Bentham was about 25 years older than James Mill. Jeremy Bentham had an aristocratic background, and he was trained to become a lawyer at Oxford University. With Bentham also something very similar happened, which happened to Mill, which was that he was not able to build a career as a lawyer. So he took to writing. And as he was about to take to writing, he came across this principle which became the axiom of utilitarianism. The greatest good for the greatest number, which incidentally is a direct translation from one of our texts, Bahujan Hitaya, Bahujan Sukhaya. How he got this idea, I have not researched yet, I intend to. It is said, the folklore is that he came across this idea in a pamphlet which he chanced upon at Queen's College, Oxford University. This is what the folklore is. I don't trust the folklore of the Western people. If I don't trust what they have written on us, I don't trust their folklore either. Anyways, the socio-political context in Britain at that point in time was extremely problematic. The society was extremely hierarchical and oppressive, and the power was fundamentally held by aristocrats, monarchy, and clergy. It was predominantly held by aristocrats because in 1688 a rebellion had happened where power had swung in favor of the aristocrats. The monarch was not very strong. Anyways, well, there's another thing that I need to add here. The aristocrats, what they would do is that they would make the clergy a part of their oppressive exercise as well. So as I said, the situation was extremely hierarchical and oppressive, and the power in the society was held by a select few comprising of monarchy, aristocracy, and clergy. Now, using this principle, the greatest good for greatest number, Bentham started writing, and Bentham was under the impression that he would write these textbooks, or rather these books, and the situation would completely transform in Britain. But power does not work that way, Power has its own grip and its own mind. Bentham continued writing, and there was something very peculiar with Bentham. He was very sage-like and a true philosopher. So while he wrote these texts, which were extremely elaborate, they were also very dense, and it was not not very easy for people to understand them. This is where the combination of James Mill and Bentham became extremely important, because what Mill, because of his journalistic background, began doing was that he started simplifying the ideas of Bentham and began writing about them in various journals. So there were two things that were happening at this point in time. One was that he was writing the history of British India, and he was also writing on the socio-political context of Britain. In 1814 or so, he was contacted by the editor of Encyclopedia Britannica, Macquarie Napier, and it was decided that James Mill would contribute a series of articles for the supplement to Encyclopedia Britannica for the next few years. So, when you look into the bibliography of James Mill, you will find that he has written many articles for the Encyclopedia Britannica between 1815 and 1824. These writings are very important, So I'm continuing the story. We'll connect all the dots. In 1817, History of British India got published, and the book began selling like hotcakes. This brought the attention of East India Company officials on James Mill, and it was decided that he would be hired as an official of the East India Company, which happened in the May of 1819. By the time, now, this is where you really need to pay attention. By the time it was 1823, James Mill became second in command of the hierarchy of officials who were working from the headquarters of the East India Company, based in London. By the time it was 1830, James Mill became the chief of the headquarters, which was called India House. In a certain sense, he was the CEO of the East India Company. How many of you are familiar with this? And why do I say that he was the CEO? Because above him, there was only a board of directors with its president, who was a British parliamentarian. So when I say that he became the CEO of the East India Company, there is no exaggeration. But let me pause here. How many of you are familiar with this fact or factoid? So what is it that you have? You have the writer of an obnoxious text on India becoming the chief of the very organization which was ruling most of India. We have not thought about the impact of this book that it had on the discourse on India, and that is what I am going to unfold at this point in time. In 1823, James Mill began supervising the revenue department at the East India Company, which was one of the 4 departments. And of course, after 1830, all the 4 departments were under him. I also told you about the association that James Mill had with Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham also had disciples. James Mill formed a cohort with them. And this cohort put together University of London in 1825. So all the writings that had been done by Bentham and James Mill began to get institutionalized. They became part of the academic discourse. James Mill died in 1836. In 1840, the East India Company commissioned the addition of another volume to the history of British India, which was written by H.H. Wilson. H.H. Wilson had spent considerable time in India and he was closely associated with William Jones. The tradition of William Jones, when it is compared with the tradition of James Mill, there are some profound differences. We won't go into them. You can very safely say that William Jones and James Mill belong to two different camps. So it was not because of ideological differences, but also because of the fact that H.H. Wilson had spent a lot of time in India studying Sanskrit texts, that he wrote a scathing critique of the 3 volumes of James Mill. All these are encapsulated in footnotes of the text that H.H. Wilson wrote. If you go through the critiques of H.H. Wilson, you will realize that they are so damaging and so damning that the first 3 volumes of James Mill should be completely chunked. But that never happened. This was the power of the East India Company. Now, the history of British India in 3 volumes also became the required reading at Haileybury College, where the East India Company officials were getting trained before coming to India. So they were coming to India with a certain understanding or knowledge of India as well as the Indian people. And because of the kind of training that they were getting, they turned extremely oppressive. And if you look into the writings of Bruce Mundis says that the 1857 revolt happened because of the discourse that James Mill had created. The East India Company officials were not that oppressive before this book came into existence. James Mill was also instrumental in the appointment of Macaulay. And if you will go through the minutes of Macaulay, you will find the reflections of James Mill's writings in the history of British India on his minutes. So while we talk about the educational policy of Macaulay, in a certain sense you can say that genealogically and ideologically Macaulay was James Mill's child. So we talk about Macaulay's children. In my understanding, that's a wrong description. We should be saying Mill's grandchildren. That is what the reality is, and I am not exaggerating here. After Mill's dispatch in 1852, institutions began to get formed in India. And whatever James Mill had written began to get funneled into the Indian educational system, and we see the impact. Because of the power that he got to wield, on India, his discourse is far more important than anyone who has written on India, either before him or after him. The paradigm that he created, which is quite evident from going into the 7 chapters that we spoke about, got reflected in publications that came out from Oxford University Press and Cambridge University Press later. The ball that James Mill got rolling keeps rolling, and it has never been deconstructed. You know, my deconstruction of his work is happening for the first time in an extensive manner in post-colonial India. Now, one last point and then I'll stop, and then we can take questions. Apart from the fact that his writings are extremely racist, there is another problem with James Mill or James Mill's discourse. That is, his discourse on India are pure imagination. Why do I say pure imagination? James Mill never came to India. And when you start comparing his writings in the history of British India with his writings for Britain, you will find that while he is using Hindu terms, he is basically describing the British society in writing about the Indian society. So when he is talking about the Hindu Brahmins, he is talking about English clergy. When he is talking about the Hindu aristocrats, the Hindu Kshatriyas, he is basically talking about the English aristocrats. When he is talking about Hindu kings, he is talking about British monarchs. When he is describing, the political scenario in Hindu India, he is basically talking about the political situation which the utilitarians wanted to expel. I have gone into complete details with this in chapter 4, where I have done this analysis. And my conclusion, fair and square, is that all that the utilitarians, including James Mill, wanted to expel from the Indians, from the British society, was used to imagine India. This is the first thing that you need to experience. The second thing is that based on this imagination, social engineering in India happened. That story I have not captured so far. I am going to do that in the future. That's part of my project. India was socially engineered, and this social engineering took speed with the formation of caste censuses 1870 onwards. So this discourse was not an intellectual discourse, as I said. It was a governance manual. It was used for policy. It was used for creating institutions in India, including Indian bureaucracy and Indian judiciary. Therefore, this book is extremely important, and it becomes extremely important to critically analyze the contributions of James Mill's writings on India in colonial India and what has been happening in India since. So, one last point, this book is open access. We can share the link of that book here. You will be able to download the complete book by going to the website of the publisher. It is available in both the forms, in PDF forms and in PDF as well as Kindle. So you'll be able to download it completely. Please go through it. It's not because I have written this book that I am promoting it. I personally think that it will become an important text for the kind of transformation that we are seeking in India. See, at this point in time, if someone asks me, are the conditions hierarchical and oppressive in India? I would say yes. Is this how it has always been? I would say no. And the reason why I would tell you this is because we have had the most emancipatory darshana system. Such an emancipatory darshana system cannot create an oppressive system. Something has happened in between. That story needs to be unfolded and unpacked. Unfortunately, it has not happened. We need to do this. We need to do this, and before we start engaging in this practice collectively, it is going to require a lot of critical understanding of ourselves. It will require a lot of critical inquiry into ourselves, because most of us here, in some form or the other, have internalized this colonial discourse. This colonial discourse has become part of our existence. We take this colonial discourse as putative reality about Indian culture. And in order to look for alternatives, or in order to look for what the truth was before the colonial interference, something else needs to be done. So, yes.
So anybody can raise questions. Yeah, please.
I need a bottle of water or a glass. So this is the book, Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children. If you will Google it, it will take you.
Such a different point of view. I haven't heard of it. I've been studying law. I'm a student of law. We've been studying Bentham and James Mill, and then we thought that he starts his book Theory of Legislation, Bentham Theory of Legislation. So whatever is being said is what we believe in, and this famous statement like say man is placed in the kingdom of pleasures and pains. So he starts the statement with that. And all fine, but then I have a thought that we are doing a reverse engineering. What I mean this reverse engineering means, so he has given this theory of utilitarianism, that means greatest good of greatest number. You said equivalent Kannada version or a Sanskrit version. Means we don't publish or we don't tell toward this and this, but then when they Westerners say something and then we come, oh, it was there in us and we just copied it. How far we can go on doing it, or how can we substantiate our point of view with that narrative?
Evidence. Always it is evidence, but that is not the central point. The central point here is that Mill's descriptions on India are pure imaginations. And interestingly, even in jurisprudence, James Mill's contributions are not spoken about. James Mill made some very important contributions in the British social and political context. And the reason why I am saying this is because he was the first one to differentiate civil code, penal code, and code of procedure. Are you familiar with this? He was the first one to do it. He took.
But not as a James Mill.
Right. So it was James Mill who made this distinction And as he was describing, the this distinction or clarification that he was making, he also wrote his text on Hindu laws. And once again, you will find that all the things that he was trying to expel from his domestic context was projected onto India. So, so instead of kind of answering the question that you are answering, asking, what I would say is that there is a profound intellectual exchange that has happened in that period. We need to investigate that period, rather than becoming defensive on what people are saying. The Britishers did not only steal wealth from us, they stole intellectual ideas from us as well. So instead of getting defensive about it, I think we need to do some work. What were the ideas that traveled from here? What happened to all those translations that went from the Asiatic societies? Did they vanish into thin air? Or something happened? These are some of the questions that need to be posed, and these are something that need to be looked into. Rather than create, areas of conflict where none exist. This is part of our colonial reality. Let's face the colonial reality. Just the way we do not have any shame in accepting that the Britishers stole wealth from here, we should not have any shame in accepting that Britishers also stole ideas from us. But what we need to do is that we need to do the work. We need to show things with evidence. That is why, despite the fact that I mentioned that the greatest good for the greatest number is a direct translation of Bahujan Hitay, Bahujan Sukhay. That is not the central thesis of this book, nor was the central thesis of my talk. That is something very ancillary, If I will start looking, and I will look for this, I'll look for this connection, I will be able to find out how this idea traveled to Bentham. I haven't done the work. But I have definitely diligently shown how James Mill's ideas on India and Hindus and Hinduism are pure imaginary constructs. I have shown those aspects candidly and clearly. And this is where, I would want you to focus your attention. As far as your question goes, when I'll find the connection, I'll come to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If you could state some specific examples as to what were the ills of their society which you are still trying to project here, maybe that would be more than
Yeah. That's a very good question. Let us see how he describes the English clergy and how he describes the Hindu Brahmins. And it is very important because this description of Hindu Brahmins has become the normative description of the Brahmins. You will see the correspondence. So this is what James Mill writes in his article called Ecclesiastical Establishments, and he is describing the Church of England and English clergy. He used to derisively call the Christianity of the Church of England as the Church of Englandism. This is the term that he used to use. He made a separation between Christianity proper and Christianity of the Church of England. So this is what he writes. And and as I'm reading this, even before I get to his description on Hindu Brahmins, start thinking about what the normative description of Hindu Brahmins today is. Start thinking about it. We think it proper to begin by distinctly stating our opinion that an ecclesiastical establishment is essentially anti-Christian. That religion can never be safe or sound unless where it is left free to every man's choice, wholly uninfluenced by the operation either of punishment or reward on the part of the magistrate. I want to stop here, and I want to stop here for a reason. Swami Vivekananda has described that while, and he was talking about, the cross-cultural comparison back then, that while the Hindu society is stratified, not his words verbatim, but something close, while the Hindu society is stratified, and he used this word religion, religion is completely free. In contrast, in the Western world, the society is free, but the religion is straitjacketed and stratified. Right? So the fact that the practice of dharma in our context was completely free must have been known to the British people. Otherwise, this idea would not have come. So he's talking about this. He's saying that the practitioners of, Christianity are not free. They are controlled by clergy. We think it proper to even go further and declare that it is not religion only to which an ecclesiastical establishment is hostile. In our opinion, there is not one of the great interests of humanity on which it does not exercise a baneful influence. This is what we call, or this is what we say about the Brahmins also. The Brahmins have exerted a painful influence on quote unquote the Indian religion. This is the normal discourse, this is what you will find in mainstream discourse. The clergy have, by a long course of usurpation, established a sort of right to call themselves and their interest by the most sacred names. Right? In ecclesiastical language, the wealth and power of clergy are religion. Substitute this with Brahmins. That's all. I can read it aloud. In Brahmanical Hinduism, the wealth and power of clergy are religion. Be as treacherous. Be as treacherous, be as dishonest, be as unfeeling and cruel, be as profligate as you please. You may still be religious, but breathe on the interest of the clergy. Make them surmise discredit at your hands, and you are the enemy of religion directly. Nay, the enemy of your God, and all the mischief which religious prejudice and antipathy, the poison deadly weapon of the clergy, can bring down upon its victims, is sure and necessary consequence of your sacrilegious audacity. Description number 1. Description number 2. Here, he is talking about how clergy is bereft of any virtue and that they abuse their power in favor of self-interest and against the benefit of their fellow beings. They are power mongers, prone to using their influence to achieve their selfish ends and causes. We desire also to be understood as disapproving an injustice of which clergymen have often great reasons to complain. That of confounding the character of individuals with corporations to which they belong. We have had many bad corporations in which excellent men are included, and such is the case of the priestly corporation. But the question is not how many clergymen from the influence of education and the spirit of the community to which they belong are in private relation and taken individually enable men. You may take a number of men, one by one, all virtuous and honorable, who yet, if you club them together and enable them to act in a body, will appear to have renounced every principle of virtue, and in pursuit of their own objects will trample without shame or remorse upon everything valuable to their fellow men. We proceed upon the principle that men desire power, that they desire it in as great quantity as possible, and that they do not desire it for nothing. Men do not strive for power that it may lie in their hands without using it. And what is the use of it? The answer is plain. It is to make other men do what we please, to place their persons, their actions and properties to as great an extent as possible at our disposal. This is known to be one of the strongest propensities in human nature and altogether insatiable. The ministers of religion are not less subject to this passion than other men. They are cited proverbially as examples of it in excess. So I gave you two descriptions of how he describes, the English clergy. Now let's see what he writes about the Hindu Brahmins. The priesthood is generally found to usurp the greatest authority. In the lowest state of society. Knowledge and refined conceptions of the divine nature are altogether incompatible with the supposition that the deity makes favorites of a particular class of mankind or is more pleased with those who perform a ceremonial service to himself than with those who discharge with fidelity the various difficult duties of life. It is only in rude and ignorant times that men so overwhelmed with the power of superstition as to pay unbounded veneration and obedience to those who artfully clothe themselves with the terrors of religion. The Brahmins amongst the Hindus have acquired and maintained an authority most exalted, most commanding, and extensive than the priests have been able to engross among any other portion of mankind. As great a distance as there is between the Brahmin and the divinity, so great a distance is there between the Brahmin and the rest of the species. So I have just given you this much. There are many comparisons in chapter 4 of this book. And I have established this thesis that whatever junk and filth that he wanted to expel from his society, he projected on to the Hindu society, to the Indian society. And because of the power that he wielded, he made that as our reality. This reality continues as we speak. So forget about reverse engineering. I would say that we need to look into how our society was carefully engineered socially. after this narrative or discourse came into existence. When we talk about the nexus of politics or and power in the writings of Foucault, this is one of the best examples. You cannot have a better example. So there's work that needs to be done. And I'm not imagining it. James Mill might have imagined it, but I have not imagined it. It took me 3.5 years of painstaking work to complete this, and another year to find a publisher. You see?
So any other questions?
Yes, please.
So sir, I'm from a psychology background.
Yes.
And I wanted to have sort of a discussion.
Yes.
So given that the foundation and the base of our country, the institutions are already of from some other source, we don't have a source for them. So when it comes to psychology, we know that we as counselors go for DSM and IC, which are of other countries' origin, Eurocentric or English-centric. So, let's say I as a person want to decolonize therapy, but we cannot identify what exactly would I define as, okay, so this is what I would say, this is colonized, so I would try to change this. And even if I come up with the idea, there is no replacement. How would I bring structure to something that I am trying to restructure?
Very good question. And this is exactly what we are discussing in the workshop that we are having. See, in order to do what we are trying to do, there are two words that will have to be mastered sufficiently, and this is going to require a lot of work. The Western world and the Indian world. Because if we do not understand this world that we are talking about, and unfortunately, because we have been raised in frameworks developed by the Western and colonial world, we continue to interpret our world, from their lenses. So the issue here becomes, do we have our lens? Will we be able to create one? How much effort it is going to take for us to create our own lens? How much of the cleansing or the deconstructing of mind that has to happen before we can even recover our pre-colonial experience or our pre-colonial world? So these are some very critical questions, So I would say that this is a very good place for you to begin your inquiry. I won't be able to give you a short answer to this. But as you will deepen your knowledge and understanding, of both the worlds that I spoke about, you will gradually, over a period of time, will begin to gain the wherewithal to write on these topics with a certain degree of authority and command. But it is a very good question, I appreciate your effort, and I appreciate the questions that you are raising. Not only here, but I'm pretty much sure that you are raising in your own being as well. I do not know if I can invite her to.
Yes, you can.
Please come to this ongoing workshop. Please join us there. It will begin at 10 o'clock tomorrow. Okay? Thank you.
Any other question?
So if you look at the contemporary impact of James Mill, what are the various manifestations of various domains in which his influence can be seen in the discourse?
Look at how ancient Indian polity is described in mainstream discourse. You'll see his influence. It's still described as authoritative and despotic, right? Where does that come from? It comes from here. Where are rulers autocratic and despotic? That's a whole different question. But in order to talk about that world, and we cannot talk about that world in a static manner either. We have to be region specific, we have to be time specific. Were our rulers that way? See, the beauty is that our ancestors have left behind numerous texts to tap into. There are a lot of people who create this binary between the textual tradition and the folk tradition. I don't think that binary existed. Why think? I'm confident that the binary did not exist in our pre-colonial world. Because all the people were part of the same collectivity. There were no, should I say classroom ceilings? In fact, it is today, when you have the educational centers that are cut off from the wider world. But are the educational centers in the Western world cut off from their world? They are not. What gets generated in their system also circulates in the wider society. A very similar kind of a thing would have happened in our society also. So this whole idea that the Brahmins were the creators of knowledge, and because they were seeking power and nothing but power, they kept all knowledge very close to their bosom, is nothing but complete falsity. Complete falsity. So coming back to your question, let us look at, how the post-colonial writers, who were ensconced in, very prestigious universities of this country, described ancient Indian polity. Look at the answer. You will find the correspondence. This discourse, as I was saying, the discourse of James Mill is unique because he got the power to institutionalize it. And what happened was that James Mill became invisible. James Mill got sequestered between two greats, Bentham and his own son, John Stuart Mill. James Mill vanished. He vanished from the scene. So, essentially, I am exhuming him. I am bringing him back. But, I have theorems on binaries. It's a whole different conversation going on in a different context. While I say that he needs to be critically examined and given his due in a negative way, I also say that Britain has not celebrated him enough. He should be knighted, as far as Britain is concerned. Because this man almost single-handedly brought about the parliamentary reforms, the famous parliamentary reforms of 1832, which introduced representative governance in Britain. And I am very serious about this, that he needs to be knighted. Britain has not recognized his contributions. Bentham on his own would have amounted to nothing if he would not have found an individual or a disciple like James Mill. He used to call himself a disciple of Bentham. It's recorded. So I don't have any misgivings in representing him as such. So look at his political writings. Look at his writings on jurisprudence. There's a lot to learn. So I would say that this book could be a beginning, but people should go into the original writings on James Mill, both for India as well as for Britain. I don't want to, cut short the questions. Please keep the questions coming. We have another 15 minutes. We can extend this further. Yes, please.
So the layman knows about British Indian history as East India Company, and after 1857, direct rule by British government or British Parliament. So even after this transition, was there no text to replace this one? What was the updating? How did they update?
H.H. Wilson occupied the Bowden Chair of Sanskrit Studies at Oxford, right? This entire framework also became part of Oxford. On the same chair sat Max Miller, right? Who gave us 50 volumes, on sacred texts of the East, right? That's how we titled it. So, this Millian tradition never got interrupted. Never got interrupted. And this can only be interrupted now if we take a collective action on it. He is far more insidious than any European author. Yes.
I just wanted to add that H.H. Wilson was in India as part of the East India Company, and he was the first one to create the Sanskrit English Dictionary project. And he was also responsible for institutionalizing Sanskrit Pathshala, which actually was a threat to, which damaged Sanskrit transmission in the later part in 1790s. And the two dictionaries which came from Sanskrit traditional scholarship were actually mentored by him, Shabdakalpadruva and Vachaspatyamu, which is considered to be very authentic Sanskrit dictionaries which came in 19th century. Carries whole range of problems in there because Wilson started engaging in training Sanskrit faculty in a particular way. And Tilak is now looking at the archives, what was happening during that period, and it's phenomenal even how traditional Sanskrit transmission got damaged. And all this were part of the East India's Company's engagement with India. So one of the other aspects of Mill's contribution is institutionalizing, really building structures within which you start functioning. That had a much more, so he discussed about the realm of ideas and how he depicted, but he institutionally also there was a terrific kind of intervention that began. So there are a lot of other friends of him who are part of this larger enterprise. And he could actually really convince and take over people like Monroe, Elphinstone, and many others were under greater influence of the Mills. So there is a much larger story. So therefore this way of thinking about India continued, irrespective of whether it was company or whether it is the British Empire which was running. So the central thread remained the same. And one of the central points that Kundan was making was that all their description of India, understanding of India was in their image. Their experience of, in fact, most of the description, the way he made contrast set, if you keep the contrast set on how they spoke about their society and look at what they were talking here, is a fantastic match that you could see.
Sir, could you say that Mill's work was sort of like the beginning of maligning India's ethos? What precedents did Mills have to do this projection?
The Europeans started visiting India after Vasco da Gama, right? In fact, they were visiting India even before that. They were visiting the Vijayanagara Empire also. Whenever they have opened their mouth on India, they have misrepresented India. So there's a long history. There's a long history of misrepresentation. There are nuances there. Even amongst the European thinkers of 1800s, you find two distinct approaches. One approach is coming from the paradigm of Romanticism, and the other is coming from the paradigm of Enlightenment. And in order to understand this nuance, I have a theorem on binaries. I was saying, I was sharing with the group that I have theorems on binaries. So that theorem is that when a thinker or a school belonging to Enlightenment came in contact with India, it projected onto India the binary halves that they were suppressing in their thinking. In terms of romantics, the romantics were projecting onto India those binary halves that they were privileging in their domestic context. And the Enlightenment people and Romanticism people, they also are divided on binary lines. So there's a nuance and there's a complexity.
We can make it much more simpler by taking one example too. It's a fairly interesting question. See, if you look at the 13th century to 15th century description of Brahmins by the Europeans in India, the Brahmins were the characters which need to be, they're worth emulating. These are Catholic descriptions. For them, they appear like the role model kind of characters. Then later came the Protestant description of the Brahmin, that these are something that, condemnable, these are very inhuman, all kinds of inequalities you can imagine. So if you look at the different kinds of descriptions that you have, depending upon which side, he took one, romantic versus the Enlightenment. But you can also look at Catholic versus Protestant engagement with these themes, and you will see, there are people who have worked on it. You can see a very interesting kind of description. For example, if we look at the standard description of Brahmins today, it appears as though there might be an element of truth. But if you go back and look at the description of Brahmin between 13th to almost 16th century, you have a completely different kind of a picture of celebrating how an ideal man should be, kind of thing. Both of them are not the real description of what these Brahmins are on there, but that's something very different. And they also play a very significant role in their internal fights between the Catholics and the Protestants, for example. From 15th century onwards, you keep getting all the reference to Brahmins, they keep alleging, talk about, I'm taking Brahmin as one theme, but you can take multiple themes from India and talk about it.
Yeah.
Show this difference.
Absolutely. And there also, binaries will operate. I've not looked into those descriptions. I've been focusing on the Enlightenment people and Romantics, so I've come up with this. There's going to be further refinement of what I'm talking about. But one thing is very certain, the Western world, the Western cosmology operates on binaries, and there are certain patterns that I've identified which I've enumerated as theorems, in this particular book and some other writings also. In a certain sense, you can say that I'm very traditional in that way because these theorems are basically supers. You observe, you go through a vast body of literature, and you encapsulate them in small ways, which can be gone through and commented upon and so on and so forth.
And the title of the book, Hindu Children, how is that titled?
The Indian American children.
Indian American Children.
Yeah. So basically what happens is that the William discourse gets reflected, in what they study 6th grade onwards. And they begin to acquire shame, inferiority complex, and a phenomena very close to baselessness, which is they want to disengage from their ancestors, from the parents and ancestors and so on and so forth, from the culture itself. That's what's being spoken about. In those chapters, I'm showing the correspondences.
Just to add additional information, he has been part of this larger debate on California textbook case. These guys were involved in large number of practical problems because parents have concerns, Hindu community parents, Indian parents have concerns. And cases over cases have been running in the United States. And he and some of his friends have been party to some of these cases. Therefore, that's, I think, is one basic reason why this theme has emerged.
I didn't want to blow my own trumpet, but the divine has been very kind in those interventions. We have been able to reduce, the problem by half at least. The other half that remains is still significant as far as I am concerned. So hopefully, by the grace of the divine, I think this book will be helpful in mitigating evil acts. We'll see.
Your comments on this. I always feel the Freudian psychoanalysis best describes the European problem. If there are many burdens of their own past which they can't deal with, there are adjustment issues whether it comes to religious tolerance, gender issues, sexuality, which they protect elsewhere on all the other societies. It suits very well. What do you think? Any comments on that?
See, there's another issue, and I started writing about it. One of my articles actually has just been accepted for publication. And among many things, I am making this claim that in the entire 1800s, the Germans were translating our texts and studying them. So is it possible that some of our own ideas have been repackaged and reformulated, within the Western context? So I have placed this as a hypothesis, in that article. And I'm saying that this needs investigation. Why I'm saying this? In 1879, the first lab of psychology was established. In fact, if we trace the establishment of psychology in the Western world, it begins in 1879. The name of the person was William Wundt. And William Wundt, as he's talking about his school of psychology, he's talking about introspection. Right? All our texts, have been talking about introspection since antiquity. The Germans were studying our Buddhist literature as well as Vedantic literature. Including Mahabharata, which of course includes the Gita, and so on and so forth. So, the ideas have certainly traveled, but as I said, and I very carefully curated my words, they have been reframed and repackaged within the Western context. So yes, while Freud was talking about the problems of his immediate cultural context in talking about psychoanalysis, there is an interesting connection which has not been investigated so far. And this brings me to our conversation earlier in the day, when we spoke about how mind is conceptualized, within our traditional scheme, without going into too many details, that mind has both the conscious as well as the unconscious aspects. Could that have influenced, Freudian descriptions? We have not investigated. And because we have not investigated, we do not know. So, going back to what I was saying, that there has been a very intimate interchange of ideas in that period. We need to very closely examine what happened.
It's actually referring to the other side of the problem, where we describe the stages of psychosexual development and the maladjustments that take place. So probably European society had these maladjustments in their own upbringing. They did not know how to deal with these issues. Therefore, they have started to project these on the other societies which they can't understand.
Yeah, that always happens. That also, in fact, projection is a Vedanta concept, adhyasa. It is because of projection that you begin to see a rope as a snake. So
nonetheless, that's what Said would argue. Subsequently, Paulo has demonstrated in different ways. But that's precisely what is the best explanation that we have.
Yeah. And in terms of projection, I have used the writings of 3 francophone post-colonial thinkers in this book. The writings of Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, and Albert Memmi. Their works are also very important, for decolonizing studies. And it is on their foundation that, that I have developed my own theory called Indian post-colonial theory. When I bring my discussions of binaries into the mix. So, this work is unfolding. There will be more iterations of this in the future. This is just a beginning, and Chaitra has been a long-term friend, in this endeavor, and I hope that we will collaborate more in the future.
So, I think we have come to the logical end, right? So, off a load of time.
I thank Dr. Kundan Singh for such an thought-provocative and informative session, and I request Ashok sir to present him with a memento.
Professor Ashok is a psychologist.
I will also like to thank Chanakya University for providing such an opportunity for us, and I thank all of you for full-heartedly participating in the discussions and the session.